Hey guys, so as usual, I wanted to provide a tier list of the best hand traps and staples in the current format using Dueling Book data from YGOscope.com in terms of the most played cards, but also using the most played hand traps and staples in some of the regional topping deck lists that were available from the last couple of weekends. So you can certainly check out my old videos in terms of how the tier score is calculated, but let's just get to it for this month. Now, of course, before I continue, a big thanks to my sponsors as always, links and discount codes for Yu-Gi-Oh cards and supplies down below. So we're going to start with this month in terms of staple tier list with Ash Blossom, of course. Not too surprising, it's usually the most played hand traps, although the my last breakdown of the most played hand traps among some of the regional events that we've had so far, Droll was actually number 1, so it's going to probably flip back and forth. You know, Ash, it's still very generic, while Branded, Labrynth, that play of those cards have gone down, or decks rather. You know, you also have emerging new strategies that say Rescue Ace. Ash is still good against that strategy in terms of, you know, ashing the emergency. Something like Unchained, you know, Ash can come up a lot as well. And you of course have Purrely, where Ash is not necessarily high impact, but sometimes it can, depending on kind of the resources they have remaining. Now, Droll was actually a very close second, really just essentially off by a decimal, so really they're kind of equal in terms of score. So of course, you know, heading into this format, a lot of people were worried about, you know, Mannadium, like Adventure Synchron, and, you know, it's a little fair, but I think definitely maybe it was a little bit overhyped because they haven't been doing as well as people thought, but you know what, you know, give them some time, maybe they will start picking up more, but at the same time, I think the play of Droll will probably start going down again a little bit, at least compared to, you know, what we just recently saw at the start of the format, where we're seeing pretty much everyone play Droll, and especially in the main, and I think right now, to be honest with you, in the main deck, it's actually not that amazing. But who knows. So now next we also have Cosmic Cyclone in terms of back removal. We saw this in the regional top cut breakdown that I did recently. It's really good against, you know, most top strategies, right? Like Purrely is like a top strategy now, and you have something like My Friend Purrely. You can get rid of that kind of like recursion that they have, especially when, you know, they can protect their cards with something like Happy Memory. So this is always nice to have against Kashtira. It's always been great. Getting rid of Rebirth can be very detrimental as well, or at least for your sake, you know, you can at least protect your grave at least. So, you know, I think it has a lot of applicability against a lot of strategies right now. And same thing for Feather Duster. You know, there's no real downside to this. Using this card, of course, we have something like Unchained, which I guess I should have mentioned when it came to Cosmic Cyclone. Banishing is always nice against that strategy, whereas with something like Feather Duster, you're just, you know, popping things. They can kind of float and trigger things, so something to consider. Of course, you know, against something like Labrynth, if they're still around, it's always nice to have some back removal for that. And, you know, even Purrely, again, I did mention about like the Happy Memory protection, but at least you can get rid of something like their field spell, and they might even have some book set too that you can get rid of, but really that's still not going to get rid of the main issue, which is the X-Purrely Noir. So, you know what, Feather Duster, I think it's fair that it's sort of in the highest category, as well as Imperm. It's a very good hand trap in the format. You know, if you watch my breakdown of, you know, what Purrely players I surveyed them, and, you know, just kind of asking what the key strengths of the deck, what are the weaknesses, what are some of the cards that are good against that strategy, and Imperm was definitely one of the most respected cards among Purrely players, just because on, you know, like the Purrely, like not only do you prevent it from adding, but also just kind of stopping or at least interrupting that attempt to exceed summon with their Purrely quick play spells. Very strong against, let's say, some of the newer strategies like Infernoble. You know, whenever a deck plays Isolde, you're always going to be able to imperm that, and it's going to be pretty impactful for the most part. Even something like Rescue Ace is another new strategy, and Turbulence, if they don't have anything to protect them from an imperm, you know, not being able to set for, kind of goes against their main key strategy. So imperm, very good, does not play into talents or thrust, super strong right now. And so, of course, moving on to the next tier, we unfortunately have D-Barrier being this high. If you watched my YCS, or rather regional top cut breakdown of the most played hand traps and staples, this was one of the most played, which is kind of unfortunate to see, because we were just at a point where we actually we were seeing a decline in this card being played, but now it's back because it just absolutely shits on Purrely. As I mentioned in that survey I did of the Purrely players, this was definitely by far the #1 card that they mentioned in terms of, you know, the card that they have to respect, although, you know, realistically you can't really play too much around it. But I have noticed definitely Purrely lists where they are playing crossout for all the variety of cards that stop them, as well as hand traps, but also putting in that D-Barrier when going second, just so that they will have a chance. And, you know, of course, D-Barrier absolutely shuts down something like Branded as well. So hopefully, I don't know when this next list is going to come, but hopefully it will finally address D-Barrier. Then we have Book of Moon. The books in general, same with Eclipse, are actually quite good right now. I mean, it technically has been for the last half year for sure, ever since Kashtira came into the mix as a meta contender, because not only is it good against Kashtira, it's also good against Purrely, which are kind of like the two top decks right now. Against Purrely, you can essentially prevent that, Xyz overlay into Purrely Noir from happening with that Purrely trap, so it's always nice. Book of Moon in particular, I guess technically also with Eclipse, you can always protect your guys as well from something that targets, like let's say Imperm or Veiler, so it's always nice to have. You can always flip face down, something problematic like Baguska or Ibli, which if it affects your deck, it's always nice to have kind of like a 1-for-1 trade like that. Nibiru, of course, is always kind of something that's going to be either, well respected or not respected at all, and then people play into it anyways. So I think, especially in like game one, where people probably won't play around Nibiru, can definitely be a big impact factor, like right against Kashtira. While they can go Rise Hard Pass with like sets, oftentimes I find, especially in game one, they probably are playing into Nib, and even Purrely. I mean, they can obviously not play into Nib, but sometimes they can, especially if they go for like another Xyz on top of kind of like your typical Purrely Noir play. So things to keep in mind. I'm definitely seeing Nibiru still being in certain side decks. If you watch that first place regional deck profile with Ryan Yu, he was still playing Nibiru as well, especially for a deck like Labrynth. I think just those kind of bombs are very, very impactful and useful for them to actually kind of come back to the grind game. We have talents. We are in talents format for the last little while now, and when you're in a format where you do still have a lot of hand traps being played, this card is going to be very, very strong. You of course have Droll being played a lot right now, so you might not really get that draw effect anyways, which technically you could argue is kind of like in a way the worst effect to use, just because it's you're kind of relying on luck. Like, you're probably really wanting to either take something out of your opponent's hand when you're going first, or take something control of your opponent's monster and can really enable OTKs. So it's been a very strong card for quite some time now, and honestly has actually been in some contentions in terms of balance discussion. Maybe it should actually be limited, and you know what, I honestly agree with that. Next we have Book of Eclipse, as I mentioned with Book of Moon, really similar along the lines. It's still very, very good right now, and of course it's a card that can be stopped by Ash, unfortunately, although maybe it's not unfortunate for some of you, because if you're like me who plays branded and you start with Book of Eclipse, if they Ash that, well, it's kind of not that bad, because now I can have branded fusion resolve probably, although I probably will still be losing at that point. Now of course we have Thrust, which is really strong because it can just get any of your power 1-ofs or whatever board break cards going second, and going first you can set something as powerful as D-Barrier, Eradicator, even the Destructive Dharma Cannon has been quite popular. Essentially it sets everything, so I think those are some pretty interesting options to run. So Thrust along, especially in combination with talents, can be very, very strong, and going second you're probably always the card is probably always live, and I think it's no surprise that people are playing this alongside with something like, let's say, Dark Ruler, which has definitely fallen in the last couple months though. We don't see as much sprite variance, for example, but with like new strategies like, let's say, Infernoble. I actually also did a survey of Infernoble players recently, and they definitely mentioned Dark Ruler no more being kind of like their Achilles heel. Of course they do have kind of like that new counter trap that they can potentially use to negate this, but against something like that, it can definitely be really strong against like combo strategy in general. Mannadium has the benefit of having a very easily accessible in archetype counter trap to deal with something like Dark Ruler no more, so that's something to consider. But nonetheless, I think it's still a very good card to have against Kashtira, for example. You know what, if your deck can't deal with the Rise Heart, this is still going to be good, because especially when they're not doing like the zone 5 lock anymore with that Mind Hacker being banned. So next we have Evenly Match, which really pairs along very nicely with Dark Ruler. If you draw both of them, you're having a good time going second. I think it's still really good, but for some reason I actually saw a decline in this card being played among some of the topping lists. I mean, maybe it sort of comes back in play. I mean, you have something like Purrely, which again, admittedly you're not going to be able to get rid of that Purrely Noir, but you know what, Evenly is still pretty good in terms of getting rid of their essentially grind game. My friend Purrely, their field spell can continuously gain them resources, so that's always nice to get rid of. Against Kashtira, it's still very, very good. Like, for the most part, they're not putting any kind of Omni Negate, so it's like really, really strong. So I personally love playing, an Evenly Match with Thrust, even in the main deck, just to easily clear boards if I do lose a die roll. So I think it's a very strong card and something you do have to respect still. Moving on to next year, we do have Ghost Spell and Haunted Mansion. This card's kind of interesting because, while you don't see as much Branded and Labyrinth anymore as we did maybe like even a month or two ago, but I think it's still seeing play. For example, against Purrely, it's a little weird. I mean, I guess you can stop something like the Purrely Noir Shuffle effect. You can even stop the, let's say, My Friend Purrely, recursion effect from the grave, even in damage step, because Ghost Spell can actually negate activation. So that's kind of interesting, unlike most of the other hand traps. So against also Branded, if you're kind of fearing the gimmick lock and want to respect it, this is also something that's very nice to have. And then we have Gamma Seal, more so just kaijus in general. Definitely seeing an increase in play again, just because again, Purrely, you know, a lot of decks will not be able to out that X-Purrely Noir with at least 5 materials, because it's going to be unaffected by activity effects. Now the problem is, you know, with that My Friend Purrely, they are going to be able to add, you know, up to 3 quick play spells back, and they're going to have a very good resource grind game and clap back. So you kind of do have to, you know, kill them like really fast, because, you know, that way, you know, whatever resources they gain after kaijuing them doesn't end up mattering if you can just beat them that turn. Next we have Call by the Grave. Not too much to say about this card. It's definitely not played as much as it was in the past. You know, it's not really like a guaranteed card anymore, but especially, you know, you do see some decks, even side deck, just in case, you know, when they go first and they really lose to certain hand traps, let's say like, you know, at Branded and Ash, or let's say a lot of decks going up against a Shifter kind of deck, they really do need some way to stop Shifter, otherwise they just completely fold. And then we also have Effect Failure, obviously not nearly as good as Imperm because it does play into talents, but you know, when you have a deck like Purrely that's going to draw on the opponent's turn and multiple draws at that, you know, drawing Veiler is definitely better than Imperm in those situations because it will actually be live, whereas Imperm, you know, if you control cards and then you draw Imperm on your opponent's turn, like you're not going to be able to use it. So I think that's why you are still seeing some play in Imperm. Being a light spellcaster tuner, does it come up? Maybe. Now, Bestials in general, not just Magmanaut, that's obviously at least actually seeing a decline in play lately. Of course, if you're playing Dragon Link, which is still a very good deck, by the way, you're going to play this regardless of whether it's good or bad in the format, just because, you know, it not only can it serve as an interruption depending on the type of deck you face, it's just in engine, it's actually very, very good for Dragon Link. So I think Bestials, you know, of course, it's a little bipolar in terms of if you're actually using it as a hand trap, just because you have something like Kashtira that never cared about Bestials. Purrely, like, you know, yeah, the little cats or dogs are, you know, light or dark, but again, it probably not really the highest impact. Again, something like Labrynth and Branded, definitely really big impact though. So, you know, and again, some of the newer strategies like Rescue Ace, Infernoble, those are like all fires as well, so it doesn't really get hurt by Bestials as much, so I can see why it's declined a little bit. We also have Lightning Storm, you know, just blow out, back row removal, might as well have them. You have Rescue Ace setting 4, so it's always nice to just get rid of those and not even really have to worry. We also have Eradicator, which is unfortunate to see, of course, really. We've been seeing this a lot the last few months. You know, not only can Labrynth tutor it out, but you just have a lot of players playing Thrust, and a lot of decks, you know, Kashtira, Branded, Dragon, like they can play Eradicator, unfortunately, and can just rip out all the spells for the most part, or sometimes traps. So this is another card that hopefully does go away on the next list. And then, of course, we have another controversial card in D-Shifter. Definitely another card hopefully goes away at some point. And so it's, you know, it's incredibly strong if you can play it. It's obviously like the best hand trap there is. But unfortunately, or rather fortunately, I should say, most decks cannot actually play Shifter, or at least not play it optimally. That's why it's typically categorized in like this C tier, because it just doesn't see as much play. But you know what, something interesting with Shifter I've noticed lately is that if the decks are playing it, they're actually back to main decking it. Whereas prior to Dune, they actually were siding it for the most part, because, you know, you had so much Kashtira being the best deck, of course, and also, you know, you had a lot of Flunder actually still hanging around, and, you know, might as well not main deck Shifter. But now we're sort of back. Even though Kashtira is still the best deck, we now have Purrely as the second best deck, right? And so when Purrely goes first, Shifter can be definitely very strong. But when I surveyed those Purrely players, they actually did mention when Purrely is going second, Shifter doesn't actually hurt them nearly as much. So some things to consider, but it's a very strong card, and, you know, kind of sacky because, you know, essentially it's either they drew it or they didn't, and it's based on luck, and you might just, you know, completely fold under it. And then we have Crossout. This is another card where we're seeing a bit of an uptick in play, especially with something like D-Barrier now seeing so much play. And with Red Reboot gone, like, the only way to really stop D-Barrier is something like Crossout. I guess technically you could also play something like Anti-Spell Arrows or Anti-Magic Arrows, which is another workaround. Kind of depends on the deck though, if you can kind of play around or with that rather. So Crossout, you know, there's a lot of hand traps being played right now. Even, you know what, something like I've seen Infernoble play Crossout just to get rid of the Dark Ruler, just because they can hard lose to it. Of course, this was kind of prior to that whole battling boxer support. So you know what, I don't think it's actually very good if you see a lot of Crossout happening in a format, but who knows. And then finally, into the final tiers, we do have Solemn Judgment, you know, pretty generic. I mean, especially again with that conversation of Red Reboot being put at 1. I mean, should Solemn Judgment still be at 3? Is that fair? I'm not sure. That's up for, you know, Konami to decide, but who knows if it will go back to 1 like it used to be just actually a few years ago. And next we have Ghost Mourner, which is a card that's not typically seen in these tier lists. It's usually not played that often, but you know what, I guess it's sort of in the mix still. You know, it's along the lines of Imperm and Veiler right now, which, as I mentioned, is very strong against something like Purrely, always pretty decent against, you know, something like Kashtira, or let's say even like Infernoble, and of course Rescue Ace. So you know what, I guess maybe not that surprising. And finally we have Super Poly. I actually thought this would increase in play compared to last month, but it actually ended up kind of decreasing, which is interesting, right? Because you actually, especially, you know, coming into the format, of course, Mannadium, you know, you could play Super Poly against them as well. Against Infernoble, Super Poly can work. And even, you know, like Rescue Ace, I'm seeing them play Super Poly themselves. They have a pretty flexible extra deck, I guess. And, you know, as long as you have Brandon in the mix, you're also going to see a lot of Super Poly. So I think it's definitely a card here to stay. I think it will probably see a little bit more increase in play, at least compared to what it is scored right now. It's still a very strong card, and definitely also conversations for this card to be put back to 1 at least. So anyways, that was the tier list by the data for the best hand traps and staples for this month. Hopefully you found that interesting and useful in terms of, you know, helping you kind of modify your deck list as you prepare for whatever other regional YCS level events that are just around the corner. So a huge thanks to all of you for watching. A big thanks to my patrons as always for supporting the channel, and well, take care guys.